Do you ever think of what it is about a campfire that's so attractive? Now, is it just the visual of the fire dancing in the night air and sparks bouncing around? Maybe a little noise from the crackling? Maybe our friends around us? Maybe we feel safe. You know, what does it take to feel safe? Maybe because there's a lot of us around and a lot of animals are scared of the fire, frightened of the light, the flame. Well, to keep a beast away, fire's as good as any. Yeah, and safety from the unknown. And I got a story to tell you tonight about the unknown. So at the edge of this little settlement of Bayou le Tor, lapped the slack waters from which the village had been named. Now just a mile to the south, they lost themselves in the Mississippi Sound. And along to the north they wound among somber swamps to disappear at last into the marshes above. Giant cypress trees crowded down to the very edge of the settlement, as if jealous of the small space of cleared land it occupied beside the bayou. And to one not accustomed to the place, it seemed that an evil boding lurked forever within the depths of those overhanging, gloomy swamps. But until the unknown beast first made its mysterious presence felt, no harm for the people of Bayou le Tor had ever come out of those swamps. Now, except the deadly malaria, which clutched its victims in shaking fits and burning fevers and then consumed life as a woods fire might consume a strip of dried sedge grass. The villagers of Bayou le Tor cowered in helpless terror as the strange beast stalked the night swamps. Cattle were herded in from the pastures long before sunset, and mothers hurriedly called their pale, wide-eyed children inside the moment the shadows began to lengthen. The first victim had been Swan Davis. He's just an old fisherman who lived by himself on the edge of the bayou above the settlement. He had been found in the swamp, dead. At first it was thought he had been beaten to death. The body was so broken up. Finally, however, it had been decided that he'd been crushed by some mysterious, unknown force. Something had caught him and squeezed him until his bones had cracked like dry reeds. Then, the three Buntley boys, driving in a bunch of steers from the marsh, were overtaken at night on the swamp road. The cattle had been going peacefully, though, when suddenly they had become frightened and they wandered off ahead, bellowing loudly. Themselves frightened at the strange behavior of the animals, the boys followed, fast as they could on foot. That is, two of them did. For when Jard and Peter Buntley emerged from the shadows of the swamp road, they found that their brother, Sims, was not with them. Terror-stricken though they were, they returned into that swamp, calling his name. When they saw nothing of him, and he did not answer their calls, they went quickly home and reported what had happened. All night long, bearing flaming torches, the men of the settlement searched up and down the swamp. Towards morning, they found the young man's body, bruised and broken, but no trace of what had killed him. And when the people of Bayou le Tor gathered to discuss the circumstances surrounding these two mysterious deaths, some declared that an evil spirit haunted the gloomy swampland to the north of the settlement, while the more conservative agreed that some creature strange to these parts, some unknown beast, was ranging the night swamps, a creature that killed for the very love of killing. Armed with a shotgun and rifle, they hunted him. They set bear traps, baited with an entire quarter of beef hung above. But no one ventured into the swamps after dark until one night 10 of the best men of the settlement formed a party. They rode out on horseback through the swamp road. Armed with pistol and sheath knife, they rode 2 by 2, knee to knee, their horses following each other nose to tail, so that if any one of the party was attacked, they all could turn and fight together. Well, nothing happened until they were on their way back. Then Walter Brandon, who suddenly, because he was one of their bravest, brought up the rear, grew careless and he lagged a little behind. Suddenly, his horse came charging in among the others, riderless. Now they could find no trace of Walter, and the other 9 could only ride in and break the news to his young wife, who carried their young child in her arms. The next day, the girl's father, old Arnie Horn, secured the services of a small, battered automobile and crossed 2 counties to see Ed Harden and beg that he come and deliver them from this unknown beast that, one by one, was killing the menfolk of Bayou le Tor. Now, in his own county, Ed Harden was a deputy sheriff, and the reputation of his prowess had traveled far. And each summer, when the fishing was best on the Sound, he came over to Bayou le Tor, and each winter he came to hunt wild turkeys in the swamps that surrounded their settlement. The people had grown to know him well, and they knew that he feared neither man nor beast nor the devil. Seeing how upset Arnie was, Ed agreed to return in the automobile with Arnie. When they reached Bayou le Tor, the news awaited them that Walter's body, which bore on it the same marks as those others who had been killed, had been found floating on the waters of the bayou, and that it was being held at the water's edge so that Ed Harden might see for himself the nature of death which this creature inflicted upon its victims. Looking upon the grisly scene, Ed Harden came away alone, grim-mouthed. When he entered Arnie's yard, it already was growing dark, the night breeze rustling in the live oaks overhead. He went to the barn and he saddled Arnie's bay mare. Having led her to the front fence, he tied her there and he went into the house. In the hallway, which divided the house through the middle, he paused as he heard in the room beside him the low sobbing of a woman. Then he passed on to the room that had been assigned to him. A small kerosene lamp had been lit and set upon the dresser, and in the light of this he was buckling on a belt, holding a broad hunting knife and a pistol, when Arnie burst in. "Ed Harden," cried the man, "what is that mare doing at the front fence? Where you be going?" "I'm going to hunt that beast, Arnie." "You ain't going to do that thing, Ed. You don't know what it is. How? "I'm going, Arnie." "But Ed, it's night. Wait till daylight. The last 2 times folks went out on the swamp road at night, they was killed." Broad-shouldered, the big deputy drew himself up to his full height and turned to gaze for a moment at his friend. "I'm going now," he said calmly. "Wait, Ed. Wait till I saddle up a hoss. I'm going with you." No, Arnie. I reckon I'll go by myself." And as he was untying that mare, those that had returned to the house gathered about him, and as Arnie had done, tried to prevent this going off alone into the swamp at night. But he swung lightly into the saddle and galloped out through the settlement into the shadows of the giant cypress trees. The mare was a spirited, nervous animal, and she leapt and she shied as she danced among the stagnant pools that lay black in the swamp road. In going out deliberately to use himself as a bait for the unknown beast, Ed felt that he could depend largely upon the mare's agility and quickness to prevent being taken unawares by a sudden rush from the darkness. He drew from its holster his heavy Colt revolver and thrust it through his belt in front, within convenient reach. So dark was the black tunnel of the road that he could see no space in front of him, and let the reins lie slack on the mare's neck, so that she might be undisturbed in picking her footing. And as he plunged deeper into the swamp, he experienced a feeling that was new to him. Time and again he had gone fearlessly out alone in the pursuit and the capture of desperate men. Now, however, he did not know what nature of creature it was he sought, and he had to invite an attack from the darkness in order to get in touch with it. The night was murky, almost sticky in its heaviness, and the swamp seemed strangely silent. Only an occasional call of some night bird pierced the stillness. He was familiar with the road, having traveled it frequently, and and the places where violence had occurred had been described to him in detail. A few hundred yards to the left of the road where he now was riding, the fisherman had met his death. Then he passed the place where Brandon had last been seen, and soon after that entered the deeper recesses of the swamp where the cattle herder had been snatched into the darkness of death. Plainly, this neighborhood of violence was the creature's lurking place. Suddenly, the mare shied, snorted, and stood quivering. Her head turned as though she saw or smelt something at the side of the road. He raised his pistol, which he now held ready cocked in his hand, and fired quickly into the darkness. As he had only one hand on the reins, it was some moments after the report before he could calm the startled animal sufficiently enough to proceed on his way. Twice more, at indication of terror from the horse, guided by her forward-pointed ears, Ed Harden fired into the black shadows at the side of the road, the discharges making lurid flashes in the darkness. The unknown beast evidently was near, following him through the brush or over the treetops. If it were on the ground, he hoped for the slender chance of killing it or wounding it before it had an opportunity to attack. After each shot, as well as he could for the plunging of the mare, he listened intently for some cry of pain or some movement of the bushes. But the silence of the shadows was unbroken. The strain was nerve-wracking, and he had a wild desire to whirl the mare about and speed away in mad flight. He could not urge her out of a slow, hesitating walk, and she frequently shied from one side of the road to the other, with those periodic halts, trembling fear. Then the road ran from beneath the arches of the swamp and passed over a corduroy crossing, bordered on each side by a dense growth of brush. The mare went more quietly now, and Ed began to hope that some of his shots had taken effect. He breathed more freely now that the branches were no longer drooped overhead. Presently, however, he found himself beneath spreading live oaks. These, flanking the road on either side, sent their giant limbs horizontally across. He peered from side to side, his eyes straining to penetrate the gloom, each indistinct tree trunk assuming a sinister outline. Overhead, the trees towered in cavernous depths, and suddenly, with a swish of leaves and branches, out of them dropped a great dark object. The frightened mare leapt forward, but the nameless creature alighted behind the saddle. Harden snatched out his pistol only to find that he was unable to use it, for he had been caught in a giant embrace that pinned his arms to his sides, an embrace against which his own great strength was powerless. The mare ran desperately, her supple body close to the ground, her graceful neck outstretched. Out from the swamp she sped, crossing the reach of flat country, once heavily covered with pines. The timber long since had been cut, only the stumps remaining, charred by forest fires, hordes of black ghosts crowding down to the edge of the road on both sides. It was a wild ride for the man, with death perched there behind. The great arms wound about him were slowly squeezing the breath from his body, and beneath that embrace he felt his ribs bend inward to the point of cracking. Desperately he maintained his grip on the saddle with his knees. Then, just before consciousness would have left him, he raised his legs and flung himself sideways. The saddle slipped under the mare's belly, and carried by the momentum, but with that crushing grip never relaxing, the man and the terrible creature which held him hurtled through the air. They struck with a thud against a shattered stump at the side of the road, while the frightened mare sped on. The murderous creature was next the stump, and at the impact its hold on Ed Harden loosened. Having slipped from the great arms, Ed flung himself over and rolled for several feet to one side. The pistol had long since dropped from his nerveless fingers, but he now quickly drew his hunting knife. Expecting an immediate attack with fang and claw, he lay on his back with his feet drawn up, very much in a position a cat assumes when defending itself. He knew it would be useless to pit his strength against that of the enormous creature, and the best he could hope for was to ward off an attack with his feet and watch for an opportunity to reach and drive home the knife. And then suddenly, it was looming there above him, and just for an instant it seemed to hesitate. Then it backed slowly away. With a quick, halting motion, walking upright like a man, it began to circle him. Its long arms swung below its knees. A round head was set on a neck so thick and short that it seemed to spring from the shoulders themselves. And as it circled about him, Ed turned also, keeping his feet always presented. Again the creature backed off, up the road. Then it turned and walked slowly away. For a moment Ed Harden lay watching it, unwilling to change his position. Then tentatively, he raised himself to a sitting position. Suddenly, as if, without looking, the creature divined his movement. It turned about at a distance of about 50 feet, and then, with a strangely human shriek of rage, it rushed toward him. As it came through the gloom, this maddened creature ran with enormous strides, a strange, loping gait, swinging its long arms from side to side. Ed dropped back into his former position, feet raised, arm held ready to strike with the knife. And before the beast reached him, it dropped forward and propelled itself by both arms and legs, and shot in a great frog-like leap through the air. The shock, as it landed upon him, drove Ed Harden's knees back against his chest. His right arm, ready to strike with the knife, was pinned and twisted painfully. The knife slipped from his hand. A long arm shot forward and talon-like fingers clutched his hair. With his legs doubled back as they were, once more he was seized in that giant embrace, and he felt that his knees were being pressed into his chest until it soon must crush in like a shattered eggshell. Then consciousness left him. When his senses slowly returned, he became aware of lights flashing and horses stomping and the sound of men's voices. Jonas Keel was speaking, and Ed had the rare experience of hearing himself discussed after he was thought to be dead. I sank almost to my bended knees to get him not to do it, but he said he wouldn't feel right to let death run loose unhindered long as he was living and with strength to fight, and when he rode out single-handed and alone, I swear the bravest man whatever drawed breath was killed. Now from his position, he judged that he'd been placed on the grass at the side of the road. Near him was someone who, from an occasional quivering intake of breath, seemed to have been sobbing. He tried to turn and see who it was, and he found that he could not so much as twitch a finger. He heard 3 new arrivals come up the road, a man on horseback, 2 men running. The rider, as soon as they drew up, said, "We come soon's we heard all you was gone to that filler Eddie. Annie's a-bringing the wagon, it'll be here directly. We passed it a piece back. But Arn didn't get the straights from Si when he come up after the wagon what it was that killed po' Ed." Old Renzy Bucker, the old man who had once been a sailor, replied to him, "Dearie lies dead. De stump done had a sliver which struck most through him." And still Ed lay on the ground, unable to move, listening to the men talk about him, thinking he was dead. He heard wagon wheels a-coming up the road, and he knew Arnie had arrived. Now in moments, Arnie was leaning over him. "Arn," Ed whispered hoarsely. There was a cry of amazement. Arnie called for a light. Someone else, evidently startled by the voice coming from what they thought to be a dead man, started to run away and kicked over the lantern and was cursed loudly by the others, who was crowding up to see the dead man speak. Now, within a few more minutes, the dead man was so far recovered that, with the assistance of the others, he was able to clamber painfully in and sink to the blankets on the bottom, every joint in his body aching. 2 days later, he was able to creep out to the front porch of Arnie's little house and sit in the cool of the breeze that swept up from the bayou. Arnie perched on the edge of his rocking chair, watched Ed with eyes like polished river stones. "Ed, what was it that almost killed you?" Ed shook his head, not quite trusting what his eyes had seen. "Now, I don't rightly know, Arnie. Whatever it was, it could have killed me easy, but it chose not to, and I can't tell you why." Reflectively, Arnie stroked his short, heavy beard. He spat into the yard. Then he turned to the deputy. "Ed," he said slowly, "you coming down here, all single-handed and alone, hunting out that critter what was killing us off, will be remembered and talked about in generations to come, when these here swamps is cleared off and drained and producing corn and taters." Ed Harden shifted painfully on the porch, his ribs still aching from where that beast had thrown him. The wound on his shoulder and the leg throbbed in time with his heartbeat. But the worst of it wasn't the pain. It was the memory. He had stared into that beast's eyes. Ed thought about the way it had loomed over him, its breath hot and rank, its massive hands curled into something that could have snapped his spine like a twig. He thought about how it had looked at him. A mixture of rage, maybe hunger, or maybe something deeper. Something knowing. "I think it's got a reason for what it's doing," he said, and it ain't just that he likes the killing." Arnie spat again. "That don't sit right with me, Ed." "Well, don't sit right with me neither," Ed replied, looking out across the yard, deep into the dark forest that led to the swampland. Now a silence fell between them, filled only by the low hum of crickets, the distant croak of a bullfrog. "You reckon it's coming back?" Arnie asked him. At that, Ed's jaw tightened. "I reckon it never left. Reckoned it's watching us right now." 2 nights later, the fog rolled in thick, swallowing up the cypress trees with their skeletal limbs and turning the world into a shifting mass of shadows. The town was quieter than usual. All the doors were locked, the shutters drawn. The people of Bayou le Tor knew better than to wander after dark. Ed Harden didn't have that luxury. Despite the pain in his side, despite the lingering stiffness in his leg, he gripped his rifle and he moved through that knee-high grass toward the edge of the bayou. His breath was shallow, controlled. Every footstep was placed with the care of a man who knew that the wrong sound could mean the difference between life and death. And somewhere in the distance, an alligator slid into the water with a big lazy splash. Then silence. Ed froze. The air had changed. The usual sounds of the swamp, the frogs, the insects, the occasional hoot of a barn owl, that had all vanished. The hair on the back of Ed's neck seemed to tingle. He could feel it. Something was out there, and it was watching him. Suddenly, there was a slight rustling in the trees, then a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground beneath his boots. Ed swung his rifle up, steadying his breath. The shadows shifted. A massive shape moved through the mist, just beyond the reach of his lantern's glow. He had seen bears before, panthers too, and he knew this was neither. The figure standing before him was tall, impossibly tall, broad shoulders nearly spanning the width of the narrow path. Its fur was dark, matted with mud and streaks of something else, something darker. Blood, maybe, but not fresh. Old blood. The beast's head tilted slightly, its glowing yellow eyes fixed deep on him. Ed swallowed, steadying his finger on the trigger. "I ain't looking for trouble." The thing huffed, a deep sound that might have been amusement or a warning. Ed tightened his grip on his rifle. He knew better than to believe in fairy tales, in legends, But standing here now, with this creature staring him down, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't like anything he'd ever imagined. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of decay, of something long dead and rotting beneath the tangled roots of the bayou. And then the beast spoke. Not in words, not in any language Ed Harden had ever heard. It was a sound, deep and ancient, something that vibrated through his chest like the echoes of a drum beaten in the heart of the earth itself. It took one step forward, its heavy footfall sinking into the wet ground. It raised one massive hand, palm outward, its fingers spread. A gesture. Recognition. Ed's breath came shallow, his body frozen in place, his finger locked on the trigger as he held the rifle at the ready. And then, as quickly as it had come, it turned and stepped back into the shadows, swallowed by the mist, vanishing between the cypress trees. Ed stood there for a long time, his heart pounding, his mind racing, arms shaking as he lowered his rifle. The beast had spared him once, and now it had let him live again. As the sun rose and the birds began their morning calls, Ed sat alone on Arnie's porch, staring at the rifle that lay across his lap. His hands felt unfamiliar as they rested against the stock. The beast had been right there, close enough that he could see the deep furrows of its brow, the flecks of mud and dried blood on its matted fur, close enough to shoot. And yet, he hadn't. He tried to tell himself that it was hesitation, a moment of weakness, but Ed Harden wasn't a man prone to weakness. He'd faced down outlaws. He'd stood his ground against murderers and worse. No, this was different. His finger had hovered over the trigger and something had stopped him. Not fear. No, something deeper. Something that sat in the pit of his stomach like a heavy stone. By early afternoon, the rumors had spread. The men in town gathered at the general store, speaking in hushed, urgent voices. Some swore the beast had been seen near the old mill. Others claimed they'd heard its unholy wailing in the dead of night. A woman clutched her child to her chest, eyes darting towards the trees. "It's going to come for us next," she murmured. The butcher, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, slammed his fist against the counter. "We wait too long and we'll be picking off the dead one by one. We need to go after it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered men. And then Arnie spoke. Ed saw it again last night. The whole room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ed, who leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He felt their stares, the unspoken questions. "Well," the butcher pressed, "you kill it?" Ed's jaw tightened. "No." A beat of silence. "Why the hell not?" Ed shifted, feeling the weight of their judgment settle on him. He could have lied. He could have told him he'd missed and the beast had slipped away before he had the chance. But the truth hung in the air between them like swamp mist. "Because it let me live." The words felt strange as they left his mouth. The room remained deathly still. The butcher sneered. "That thing's killed 3 of our men already. It ain't no damn guardian angel, Harden." Ed met his gaze. "Never said it was." That night, Ed found himself drawn to the bayou once more, lantern in hand. He had told himself it was his duty, that if the beast was still out there, he needed to track it down before more men died. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Something inside him wanted to see it again. The water lapped against the roots of the cypress trees, carrying the stench of damp earth and decay. The wind had died, leaving the air thick and heavy. fireflies danced in the darkness, their tiny lights twinkling in and out like stars drowned beneath the swamp. And then he saw it. A disturbance in the water. Something was moving. Slowly, cautiously, Ed raised his rifle. The beast emerged from the darkness, its massive form half hidden in the reeds, and stood there, silent, unmoving, watching him, the water dripping off its wet, matted, furry body. They faced each other across the bayou, the hunter and the hunted, though Ed was no longer sure which was which. His grip tightened on the rifle. He could end it now. One squeeze of the trigger and this nightmare would be over. And then something stirred in the darkness. A second figure emerged from the shadows of the cypress trees, stepping into the silver light of the moon. This one was smaller, but no less powerful, its fur rippling like black silk in the night air, and in its arms, cradled with a careful tenderness that sent a shiver through Ed's bones. A child. Not human, but not entirely beast. It was small, barely reaching the creature's chest, its fur dark and thick like a young bear, its eyes wide and unknowing. The little one let out a soft mewling sound, clinging to the larger creature's arm. Ed's breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. The beast wasn't just some mindless killer. It wasn't hunting for sport. It was protecting its family. His rifle suddenly felt unbearably heavy in his hands. He had come here thinking himself the righteous one, the lawman sent to rid the swamps of monsters. But now, staring at the mother and the child before him, he felt a terrible, creeping shame. The town had never stopped to ask why the beast had come, and why it had attacked, and why the bodies of the dead had been found near the water's edge, ripped apart but never eaten. Perhaps the men who had vanished weren't just victims. Perhaps they'd been trespassers. Perhaps they had been threats. The male beast, massive, looming, stood unmoving on the shore. Its glowing eyes locked onto Ed's. Its breath came slow and deep, misting in the cool night air. It could have killed him twice now, and yet it had spared him. And now Ed understood why. Because even though Ed had raised his gun, he hadn't fired. The town, they'd never understand. The men with their torches and their rifles would come, and they wouldn't stop until every last one of these creatures was dead. But Ed Harden wasn't so sure he wanted to be part of that anymore. Slowly, he lowered his rifle. The beast made no sound, no movement, only watched. And then, as if sensing the decision had been made, it turned. The mother cradled her child tighter, stepping back into the gloom. And together, they disappeared into the bayou, swallowed by the night. Ed stood there for a long time, rifle limp in his hands, the calls of the swamp creatures filling the heavy silence. For the first time since coming to Bayou le Tor, he knew exactly what needed to be done. The beast had spared him. And now it was his turn. He would go back to town and tell them a lie. He would tell them he had chased the creature away, that the swamp was safe once more. But Ed knew that lies alone wouldn't keep that town safe, not forever. People had a way of wandering where they shouldn't, of testing the edges of the unknown. So before he left the dark, mist-laden stretch of bayou, he made sure that beast understood. Standing at the water's edge, he called out, his voice steady, though his hands still trembled. "I'll keep them away," he said. The beast, still watching from the shadows, gave no sign of understanding, but Ed had a feeling it did. It had spared him for a reason, just as he had spared it, and now an unspoken truce had been forged in the stillness of the swamp. The killing would stop because the threat was gone, the real threat, The men who had ventured too far, too bold with rifles raised and fear in their hearts. The beast had only done what any father would do, and now it would keep to its side of the bayou, just as Ed would keep the townsfolk on theirs. And if anyone was fool enough to go wandering into the deep places of the swamp after this, well, some secrets were meant to be left alone. Because some legends weren't meant to be hunted. Some were meant to remain in the shadows where they belonged. And some truths are just too big to share. And that, my friends, I guess that's a little metaphorical, but it's a good story. And it kind of reminds us what we're all about. You know, we're stewards as well. We're supposed to live off the land and enjoy the harvest and the bounty, and we're also supposed to protect it. Just as we protect our own families. So friends, I'll see you again. It won't be that long. Take care of yourselves. This is Clay Steele. Good night. Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee-itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee-itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.